are pleased to have with us as our keynote speaker this afternoon, Dr. Robert Zatorre. His background and PhD are in experimental psychology, and he is a cognitive neuroscientist at the famous Montreal Neurological Institute affiliated with McGill. His biography is in your program, and I won't reiterate all of it. He, most importantly, is an organist. If I had known that ahead of time, we would have had something set up for the Bach toccata and fugue. He has published on music and emotion, pitch perception, and other topics of interest to us. He is here for two reasons from my perspective. First, to share with us a different set of scientific skills for looking at issues with which we are interested. And second, we hope, to correct a deficiency that I see in his curriculum vitae. He's won awards on research in neuroplasticity, on hearing, but not a thing in voice that I saw. Did I miss something? No. So we hope that not only will you give us insights and new perspective, a new window to look at problems of interest to us, but that we also hope that you will spend enough time listening to the program that you will absorb at least a little of our passion for voice and begin looking at the human voice through your own labs. Dr. Zatorre.
Thank you for the kind introduction, and thank you all for being here and for inviting me. This is, I've always heard about this meeting. I know it's a terrific meeting, and so I'm really glad to be able to finally see a little bit of what it's like. So what I'd like to do this afternoon is to give you kind of a broad overview of some of the research we've done in our lab, which focuses on different aspects of musical processing, and it encompasses both perceptual aspects as well as aspects of music production. And finally, I want to link that to pleasure and emotion associated with music. So to start, I just want to make the point that music is actually a very ancient feature of the human species. We know this from pretty remarkable archaeological findings. So for example, these flutes that you see here were found in what is now China, and they're something like 5,000 years old or so. They have the distinction of being the oldest playable musical instruments. So you can actually play these things, and they sound like this. Absolutely beautiful, isn't it? It's 5,000 years old. Now, of course, no recordings were found in the cave along with these flutes. So this is, the Chinese scholars' best interpretation of what it would sound like. However, the tone quality and, importantly, the pitch patterns are exactly as they would have sounded because those are fixed by the type and size and distance between the holes in the flute. So the scale that you heard, which is roughly a pentatonic scale, is in fact the same scale that would have been used then. Now, at the time this paper was published, these are the oldest instruments. More recently, even older instruments have been discovered in the Danube Valley, and these date to the Upper Paleolithic period, something like 35 to 40,000 years ago, a time when this part of Europe was under glaciation. So the folks who were sitting around in this part of the world did not exactly have an easy time of it in terms of survival, and yet they took the time and effort to create these remarkable instruments. Now, if you think about it for 1 second, this is quite a technological development here to be able to carve a piece of bone from an animal's leg and drill holes in it at precise intervals to get music. And to me, what that suggests is that music must be much more ancient than this. And I have a suspicion you will agree with me if I ask you, well, what would have been the first musical instrument? Right? I'm sort of preaching to the choir here, literally maybe. But, you know, obviously the voice does not fossilize. The instruments do, but if 40,000 years ago there was already such a high level of technological development and the existence of scales and musical structures, it suggests that probably music is much, much older than that, and I would suggest as old as the human Homo sapiens species. In fact, some people believe that Neanderthals may have had music as well, based on some other more controversial archaeological findings. So, in a sense, music is part of our original mental machinery. And this lecture is not about the origins of music or about evolution, but I do want to go over this question, which is, you know, why do we have music? And of course, Darwin was one of the many thinkers who considered this, and he had this to say. This is his most famous quote about music. In The Descent of Man, he says, "Neither the enjoyment nor the capacity of producing music are faculties of any direct use, and therefore they must be ranked amongst the most mysterious with which human beings are endowed." So he basically said, it's mysterious, I don't know, I have no idea. This is in 1871. Now, in 1881, he wrote his autobiography, and he has some very personal reflections that I think are very insightful. He says this: "If I had to live my life again, I would have made a rule to read some poetry and listen to some music at least once every week, for perhaps the parts of my brain now atrophied would have been kept active through use," which is an interesting idea, relating perhaps to neuroplasticity and rehabilitation. And then he says this: "The loss of these tastes is a loss of happiness and may be injurious to the intellect and to the moral character by enfeebling the emotional part of our nature." And I think in this, you know, very personal, sort of introspective statement, he's actually answering the question that he had been unable to answer 10 years earlier, which is, why do we have music? The reason why is because it enables us to communicate and express emotions. So, I'm not really there are many aspects of emotion that one could talk about. I'm not going to talk really about all the different elements. I'm really going to try to think about musical pleasure and how does it arise, why is it there? Considering that music consists of a series of sounds which are typically concatenated according to some set of rules. There are many combinatorial possibilities. The individual elements are themselves not really meaningful, whether they be tones or percussive sounds. It's the way that they're combined. And unlike speech, music is completely abstract in the sense that it does not denote any specific content. Whereas speech sounds, when they're appropriately concatenated, convey specific denotative content. That's not the case for music. So how is it that these patterns of sound can elicit these emotions? So the plan of the talk is an attempt to answer this question. And basically I'm going to go over three sets of findings from our lab and from a few others. First of all, I'm identifying some of the neural mechanisms involved in both music perception and music production. And that involves the auditory cortex and a series of other cortical circuits that are linked to it. Secondly, I'll talk about neural mechanisms of pleasure and reward and motivation, which largely have to do with subcortical structures, in particular the striatum and other related structures. And finally, I will argue that it's the interaction between those two systems, the cortical perceptual production mechanism and the subcortical reward system, that are actually the source of aesthetic pleasure as we experience it with music. So to give you kind of a very global introduction to the circuitry, cortical circuitry involved in music perception and production, this sort of illustrates some of the key circuits that are involved. And this is a close-up here. So in green you see the auditory cortices, which are found in these temporal lobes, temporal gyrus, and from there you have different, let's see, oh, you can't see the cursor, can you? Okay, well, Going posteriorly, you have connections going from the posterior part of the auditory cortex into the parietal lobe, and from there into the premotor cortex. And going anteriorly, do we have a puncture? Ah, a puncture is lovely, thank you. Thank you very much. So, posteriorly, going from auditory cortex up to the parietal lobe, connecting eventually to the premotor cortex, and going anteroventrally from anterior portions of the temporal lobe to frontal regions, and actually looping around. So this is a bidirectional loop. There are also direct connections from auditory cortex, both ventral and dorsal premotor cortex. Now, what we know about the functionality of these systems, I'm just going to give you sort of a taste with a bit of a historical flavor to this. Some of the first evidence that we have about the importance of auditory cortical areas for the representation of music comes from Wilder Penfield, who was actually the founder of the institute that I work in, which is shown on the stamp here. That's the institute right there. And as you probably know, he was studying epileptic patients who were awake during the surgical procedure, and by passing a brief current to particular cortical locations, he could elicit certain kinds of sensations. And an interesting observation is that when certain portions of the superior temporal gyrus were stimulated, patients would report that they were actually hearing music. And this is a true hallucination, to the point where famously one patient said, I hear music, it's, you know, this popular song, and why did someone bring a radio into the operating theater? That's how vivid it was. So this suggests that these portions of the brain must contain some kind of stored representations of auditory experience, such that when the current is passed, you reactivate those traces. And I'll come back to that concept later on. So this is in the 1950s and 60s. Now we zoom forward about 30 years to the dawn of functional imaging research, and this is actually one of the very first studies that I ever published in this domain in the early 1990s. And what we were trying to do here was just to identify brain areas that were responsible for the encoding of, or at least responding to tonal patterns. So a very simple paradigm in those days. We weren't doing anything too fancy. We were comparing perception of these melodies to these acoustically matched noise patterns. And we basically got activity in the superior temporal gyrus on both sides, larger on the right. And this sort of corroborates some of those early findings that these areas might be important for the analysis of musical sounds. Now we zoom forward another couple of decades to more recent work that we can do with functional imaging, which is quite a bit more sophisticated than what we could do back 20 years ago. And in this study that was done by Mike Klein, one of my former PhD students, what we were asking people to do was to listen to these musical intervals. I don't know if you can see them, but I'll let you hear them. So if you hear this and you're a reasonably trained musician, you know that that is what interval?
Minor third.
Minor third, very good. And if you hear this, it's also minor third, very good, right. But they're two different notes, right? The first one is a C and an E flat, sorry, it's a D and an F, and the second one is a C sharp and an E. So those are both minor thirds. And if you're a reasonably trained musician, you can distinguish those, let's say, from a major third, which sounds like this, or from a perfect fourth, which sounds like this. So what we did in this experiment is we played this entire matrix of 9 silents, so 3 different intervals, minor, major, fourths, versus 3 pitch levels, C, C sharp, and D, I think it is. And then we looked throughout the entire brain volume using an artificial intelligence algorithm, a pattern classifier essentially, whose job it is to look at patterns of activity within a patch of voxels, and then decode which stimulus the person was listening to. So we record the data as the person is listening to the stimuli, then we train the algorithm on that data, and then we test it on an independent set of data and ask the algorithm, okay, now you tell me what was the sound that person was processing at that time. And what we find is that we can actually decode all of the minor thirds from all of the major thirds, and all of the major thirds from all of the fourths, and so forth, irrespective of pitch level, in this location here, which is actually in the superior temporal sulcus, so part of that more ventral stream of auditory processing that I showed you. So that means that neurons in this location are actually encoding the relationship between these tones. Importantly, they do not distinguish between different pitch levels. So if you go horizontally, there's nothing in the brain that can distinguish that. That's because these people did not have absolute pitch. So they don't encode absolute information, they encode relative information. So the auditory cortex can actually do some fairly abstract analysis. Here's another example of a certain level of abstraction that the auditory areas, along with the more ventral frontal regions, are able to do. And this comes from work done by Mark Schoenwiesner and Barbara Tillman. And in these experiments, you basically have a sequence of events that are occurring. And then there's a certain event that occurs which is unexpected in the context of the preceding set of sounds. So for instance here, you have a sequence of chords, and this is followed either by a chord sequence which is the expected cadence here. So if this is a, I don't know what it is, it's maybe a 4 chord, and this is a 5 and 1. Or here it's in a different key, and so you hear the same exact sound here, but it doesn't really correspond to what came before it. And interestingly, you get responses in auditory and frontal regions that are sensitive to the regularity based on the expectancies. In other words, a particular sound is responded to not only in terms of the quality of that sound itself, of the features inherent to the sound, but also of how well that sound corresponds to what would be predicted based on a pattern that came before it. And this, of course, means that there's some kind of memory system here, because the regularities that we're talking about here would be something that you would have learned implicitly by virtue of having grown up in a culture where this particular pattern of sounds would be very commonly heard. So those are several different aspects of sound encoding. Here's another one, musical imagery. So musical imagery is the ability to imagine sounds, to actually sort of hear them in your mind's ear. And the best example of this is perhaps Beethoven, who, as you know very well, became very deaf late in his life, and yet composed magnificent music. So he must have been able to internally perceive these sounds that he was able to write down. You may or may not know this, but if you go to the Beethoven Museum in Bonn, you will find these so-called conversation books. These are books where people who come to see him would actually write down their questions to him, because he was so deaf that even if they shouted right in his ear, he couldn't hear a thing. So they'd have to write what they wanted to ask him, and he would respond. Well, we don't have Beethoven to scan, unfortunately, but we do have undergraduate students, and you never know, some of them might become the next and we have them do a little karaoke experiment, which they sort of enjoy. In this experiment, you either listen to music that you're familiar with, or you imagine the same music. And what I'm showing you in green are the brain areas where both of these things are overlapping. So brain regions that respond both to real sound and to imagined sound. The real sound, of course, is in the superior temporal gyrus, as we expect, those orange regions. But notice that these green regions in the periphery, both posteriorly and anteriorly, are also active, even in the complete absence of sound, when people are imagining those same songs that they might have heard on the previous trial. So this speaks also kind of to the ventral sort of experiments. It suggests that these areas of the brain may have stored perceptual templates such that they can be reactivated at will, in this case by the cue of the karaoke. So we've talked mostly about the pathways that have to do with the auditory cortex, in terms of perception. But as this little diagram suggests, we're also interested in production, and indeed, you could not have music perception were it not for somebody producing it, right? It has to be musical production to go along with perception. And because this is a meeting interested in voice and song, I want to tell you about some experiments we've done on singing as a means of exploring the production aspect of music. And this video comes from Boris Kleber, who's one of my former postdocs, who's now in Aarhus in Denmark. And Boris is a sort of former amateur opera singer. And he actually came up with this paradigm, which is sort of clever. So in order to look at vocalization, we're able to get people to sing in between the time periods when the scan is going on. So we're using a fMRI procedure called sparse sampling. You will hear the scanner, and then you'll hear the voice. And on the screen you see the instruction to the subject, which is to sing or to not sing, depending on the moment. Here's it coming. The environment is not the most optimal one for singing, although some of the singers compared to singing in the shower because the tube of the scanners sort of resonated. So when we do experiments like this, we can actually identify what we've now called a singing network because we've been able to replicate it in numerous experiments. And it consists not only, of course, of auditory cortex, but also the motor cortex, notably the laryngeal representation, which is found about here. As well as premotor cortex, supplementary motor area, which is in the interhemisphere fissure, which you don't see there very much, the insula, and not depicted here, the cerebellum. So this is it encompasses part of that sort of dorsal network where auditory and motor systems have their interface. Now we can go further than just identifying the network by looking at some of the properties of this system. And in particular, we're interested in auditory motor integration, because it's one thing to show that auditory and motor areas are active, it's another thing to show that they're actually working together. And so for this, we've borrowed the pitch shift paradigm, for which Chuck Larson has made so many important contributions. And in this study, done by Jean Zatorre, one of my former PhD students, we implemented this pitch shift paradigm. So what happens is that you hear a target tone, and then you're supposed to repeat it. And at some point, the pitch is shifted. So what you hear is this. That's the shift, right? It occurs at an unpredictable interval. And your job, depending on the condition you're in, if you're in the so-called ignore condition, your job is to maintain the pitch, which is actually hard to do, as you can see from this trace here. And it sounds like this. So it's wavering, but the person is able to maintain roughly that pitch profile. In the so-called compensate condition, what the singer hears is this. So they hear the shift, and then they're meant to compensate for it. So they have to correct for the shift that's introduced to their ear. And so they can do that pretty well, actually. So they move up to compensate for that. When we look at the behavioral data from that, if you just look at the second panel over here, this is for the ignore condition. In black are trained singers, in white are non-singers. And in the ignore condition, there should be no change. So this is the, it's a 200 cent change, so it's a fairly large cent, that's 2 semitones. The trained singers are able to ignore this perfectly well, whereas the untrained singers actually are tricked by it a little bit, and they do shift even though they're instructed not to. On the other hand, when they're asked to compensate, everyone compensates, everyone goes up almost to the exact correct level. And when we do this in the scanner, we find that many of those regions that I showed you as being part of the singing network, are kind of overactive during both of these conditions. So basically, this more dorsal network, in particular the interparietal sulcus here and the premotor regions, as well as the insula, are really engaged when you're trying to do this interface between what you hear and what you are trying to produce. We have gone a little bit further in this research, now looking at other forms of music production. And I keep showing you this diagram of the musician playing the violin. We have been unable to get a violin into the scanner, but we've done the next best thing, which is to get a cello into the scanner. This is my student, Melanie Sagado, who is actually a semi-professional cellist herself, as well as a neuroscientist. And we had this instrument devised by the music technology team at McGill. Evan Hollander was the engineer in charge of this. It's got a tiny little bow that just fits in the bore of the magnet. You know, you can play it. It's hard, but it can be done. And the whole thing is made of resin and a lot of 3D printed parts. The strings are made of gut, so they're very historically accurate. And what we did in this experiment was ask trained cellists either to reproduce a tone that they had heard on the cello, or to reproduce a tone by singing it. And we're just looking at what's in common or what's different between the two. And here's the results. So once again, you see the same regions that we keep talking about: auditory cortices, motor cortices, supplementary motor area, cerebellum. And interestingly, what you have in red is the singing, what you have in blue is the cello. And you notice there's a tremendous amount of overlap, right? All of the blue and red areas overlap, with the exception of the motor cortex itself, because the laryngeal motor cortex is slightly more ventral, whereas the hand region is slightly more dorsal. And in playing the cello, of course, you're using your hands and your wrists. But I'm struck by the degree of overlap between these two systems, and I think it suggests that there's a common sensory motor framework, irrespective of the precise type of motor control that's required for singing versus playing the sort of, you know, arbitrary sensory motor mapping that's demanded by the cello. And I'd like to think that, you know, when your cello teacher used to tell you, make your instrument sing, maybe they were sort of onto something. Just to finish the section on the production aspect, one thing that's really interesting is to look at how plasticity may be involved in enabling the expertise that's important for being able to play an instrument. And we've done this in several different kinds of studies. And the idea of plasticity is actually quite old. I'd like to show this statement from Santiago Ramón y Cajal, who in 1904 said, "The ability of a pianist is not accessible to the uneducated man," meaning the person who's not trained, "since the acquisition of the skill requires many years of mental and physical practice. To understand this complex phenomenon fully, it becomes necessary to admit the formation of new pathways via progressive growth and branching of dendritic arborizations and nerve terminals." This is pretty cool. 1904, he was predicting that the learning of a new skill, and he specifically mentions music as one such skill, would result in anatomical changes to the structure of the cortex. Of course, he had no evidence for this, but it was quite a prescient view. And we can now look at brain anatomy, again using magnetic resonance imaging. And what we're looking at here, in some work done by my former student Patrick Bermudez, we're looking at cortical thickness measures. So this is just what it sounds. We model the outer surface of the cortex, we model the boundary between gray matter and white matter, and then we look at the difference between the two surfaces as an index of thickness. And when we compare musically trained to musically untrained persons, we see greater thickness in the auditory regions, as well as in the motor cortex, and also in portions of the frontal cortex. So this suggests that indeed there is some kind of specialization that goes along with musical training. This specialization can actually be very precise, and I think this result may be of interest to you. So this again is from Boris Kleber, when you look not just at a global group of musicians, but specifically at people with extensive training in singing, when you look at their anatomy, you see a change in the gray matter corresponding exactly to the representation of the larynx. And this is essentially mapped from, well, the Penfield, of course, who mapped out the somatosensory regions. In fact, this area is more in the somatosensory part than in the motor part, which is interesting considering the importance of somatosensory feedback in singing. As well, the degree to which these changes happen in these somatosensory regions corresponds to the amount of singing practice. So this is, I guess it's thousands of hours of singing practice along this axis. Each note represents an individual, and this is the degree of change in that location. And you can see that the more training you have, the more change occurs. So it really suggests that it's experience-dependent plasticity. So I've really talked about these different networks going from auditory cortex both up into the dorsal stream and into the ventral stream. These different mechanisms enable the encoding of different kinds of sound features, as well as the relationships between the sound features. So a certain level of abstract encoding. These circuits enable us to be sensitive to regularities that might occur in a pattern of sounds, allowing us to make predictions and to anticipate what's coming up. They're also active when we are playing out previously experienced representations. That's what we call imagery. And furthermore, they're essential for auditory motor interactions and are enhanced with musical training. So all of that sort of fits very well, but it does not tell us anything about pleasure. I promised you at the beginning that I was going to tell you something about pleasure. And indeed, in a sense, pleasure is maybe the most important aspect of music. I'd like to use this illustration from a vase that's about 400 BC, I think. It's in the British Museum. And it depicts Ulysses here, who, as you know, wanted to hear the siren song. Sirens look more like pigeons, but anyway, they're supposed to be beautiful and seductive, and it's really their song that is the most important thing. And the sailors, of course, had their ears plugged up with wax so they wouldn't be seduced by them, but Ulysses bound himself to the mast and had himself experienced what this was like to get to this peak ecstasy that is produced by the human voice and by music. So where does pleasure come from? In particular, what's the neurobiology of pleasure and what psychologists refer to as reward? Well, there are many different things that are highly pleasurable for human beings. Here are a few different ones. I don't suggest you try all of these in one evening. What's interesting is that some of these things are really necessary for survival, like food or sex, which is necessary for the species to survive, if not necessarily the individual. And then some of these things are actually drugs that hijack the reward system, which is why they become rather dangerous, because these are substances that can become addictive. What they all have in common is that they essentially recruit the same set of regions in the brain. In particular, these deep structures, the basal ganglia and portions of the basal ganglia like the nucleus accumbens and the caudate, which are collectively called the striatum, sometimes referred to as the dorsal-ventral striatum. So these regions are strongly active to those different kinds of stimuli and are dopaminergic in nature. So they receive their dopamine inputs from the ventral to ventral area. And this is a very complex system. There are thousands of research studies done on this. I can't do justice to this entire literature, but one of the interesting concepts that has been promulgated by people like Wolfram Schultz is that dopamine neurons in this region encode not just the reward value of a stimulus, but the what's so-called reward prediction error. That is, the degree to which the reward that you are receiving is greater or lesser than the reward value that you expect under the circumstances. I'll come back to that concept. when we do human imaging studies, or this is from a meta-analysis by James McGill, what we find is that different kinds of rewards all activate basically this ventral striatal region. So these are studies using monetary rewards, these are studies using food rewards, these are studies using erotic rewards. So basically money, food, or sex, they all have in common recruitment of this region of the striatum, along with a few other regions like the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. And this is from functional imaging studies using fMRI. One can also look at actual dopaminergic uptake, and in these particular studies, people being given cocaine, amphetamines, or alcohol all show, again, not only activity in the ventral striatum, but specifically dopaminergic activity. This is using dopamine tracers with positron emission tomography. So a few years ago, we asked ourselves, could music engage this same system? Even though music is not a drug, it's not a substance, nor is it, strictly speaking, necessary for survival the way that food or sex might be. And in some work I did with Anne Blood, who was a postdoc in my lab at the time, she's now at Harvard, we decided that the way to study this was to look at, to try to identify a specific and reproducible phenomenon associated with pleasure that would be objectively identifiable. And we settled on this idea of chills, which is something that people experience, very frequently report, as an extremely pleasurable, almost ecstatic moment that occurs during a particular musical passage. How many of you know what I'm talking about? It's quite common. It's, you don't have to be a trained musician to experience it. And so then we looked at, indeed, if we could measure this. So we get people to listen to music that they select as being music that gives them chills. We ask them to identify the moment when the chill occurs by using a subjective rating. They do so. And then we measure physiologically objective measures like skin conductance and respiration and heartbeat. And sure enough, we get peaks in the skin conductance and the heart rate, really all of the physiological measures that correspond to the subjective measure. The skin temperature goes down, which is why it's called a chill, right? Because it's actually a vasoconstriction of the skin. Also, that's why you get piloerection, the same mechanism. When we presented these results to our colleagues in music theory, they said, well, of course, we've known that for quite a long time, because if you read Leonard Meyer's 1956 treatise on music and emotion, you will see that he argues that musical pleasure arises from the fulfillment or the suspension of musical expectancies. That there are various kinds of tensions that are created in a musical piece that are resolved to a greater or to a lesser extent, and that composers understand this, and so do performers, and they exploit this concept to maximize pleasure. And I have here a little excerpt from Tristan and Isolde. I didn't think I should play the entire opera because it walks in at 4 hours. But it's a really good example of this concept of, unfulfilled expectancy. And here's what a musicologist, Kramer, had to say about it. Tristan and Isolde has always been understood to represent desire as an endless ebbing and flowing, forever renewing itself, craving and languishing. This is the language of drug addiction, right? Craving. So I think there's a very interesting link here between these quite different phenomena. So this is sort of where we stood until a couple of years ago, and people said to us, well, okay, this is great, but you're using this musical chills phenomenon, this is like a peak experience, whatever you want to call it, and maybe this dopamine system is engaged during that kind of experience, but that doesn't characterize your normal, usual, everyday kind of musical pleasure. When you just hear a nice piece of music, you really enjoy it, you maybe have a chill, but what's going on in that situation? And so Valerie Salenberg, who was still my student at the time, said, okay, let's do a different kind of experiment where we were going to forget all about chills. We're going to use a totally different paradigm, one borrowed from neuroeconomics. And in this paradigm, you are exposed to a sequence of stimuli, and for each one of them, you're going to assign a monetary value to how much you want to purchase that stimulus. So it's actually, we call it the iTunes paradigm because the interface was just like iTunes. you get 30 seconds of music exposure, and then you have to say, well, how much money would you spend for it? If you want to buy it, 0. If you want to spend 99 cents, you spend 99 cents. We actually gave people a budget. This is actually like real money. Well, it's not real money, it's Canadian. The music we used was music popular amongst a certain segment of the McGill campus at the time, and I just want to illustrate some of it for you. I would give $0 to that one. So it's not bad. That's information it's a reward prediction error because they're actually expecting things to occur on the beat and then they occur just off the beat. So it's actually a little bit different than what should be predicted. So the way we do the experiment is each individual listens to every one of these 70 different excerpts. For each one of them, they assign a dollar value. We then use the monetary value as a regressor on the brain activity. So we're looking for brain areas whose activity scales with the amount of money each individual participant is giving for that particular stimulus. So this allows us also to look at individual variation. You don't have to like every single stimulus. All we need is variance in the assignment of the monetary values. And sure enough, what we get is the nucleus accumbens. So the ventral striatum, same region we had seen earlier as being the region that shows an increase in dopamine with musical chills, shows increase in brain activity the more money you spend. So this is independent of chills. You're not experiencing chills, but the more pleasure you experience from that music, as indexed by the monetary value, the more your nucleus accumbens is responding. And not only that, but when we look more at the connection between this system and the rest of the brain, we see something very interesting. So we can do something called functional connectivity, where you look at the time course of the activity in this particular spot, and you correlate it with the time course of activity in other regions. So the idea is that if two distant regions are interacting in some way, you will see a lot of correlation between them, whereas if they're independent, they would not be correlated. And when we look everywhere in the brain, what we see is the auditory cortex. That is to say that the more valued an item is, the stronger the interaction between the reward system and the auditory system. For music that is not valued, this correlation is essentially 0. And I think this is really quite important because it links together these two systems that I've been talking about. On the one hand, the auditory cortex and all of its cortical circuitry with the reward system, because these two systems are actually interacting when you're actually experiencing the greatest pleasure. Now, if this is true, we can test it in various ways, and in particular, we can ask the question, okay, if this is really the source of musical pleasure, what happens if we disrupt the system? Can we actually look at the way that musical pleasure might be altered by changing the coupling between these systems? And we approached this question in a couple of different ways. So in one set of studies that I did with Ernest Mascarero, when I was on sabbatical at the University of Barcelona, we identified people that we think have what we call specific musical anhedonia. These are people who were selected to respond very, very low to music in terms of how much pleasure they experience, compared to all other kinds of things like food and money and sex and exercise and drugs. So these people just, are perfectly normal in terms of their responses to these other kinds of stimuli. They just don't respond to music. When we look at the physiological responses, these are just behavioral responses. You could say, well, they're just telling you that, but it's not really true. Indeed, when you look at these people with musical anhedonia, they show almost no response to skin conductance and really no response to heart rate when they listen to music that everyone else finds pleasurable. these are the responses in the average listeners, and in the white bars you have what we call the hyperhedonics. These are people who are super music lovers. So physiologically, their responses correspond, and this is actually shown here. So in the red are the musical anhedonics. You see they just don't show any response compared to everybody else. Importantly, we give them a gambling task. This is a money reward task. It's called a monetary incentive delay task. It's one that's been used a lot in the literature. And when you win money in this game, or you lose money, you get a big physiological response. And this is exactly the same for all three groups. So there's nothing wrong with the reward system per se. It responds when they're playing this video game and they get money. They like money just like everyone else does. They just don't like music. So we then put them in the scanner, doing both of these tests. So they do the music listening test and they do the gambling test. And what's important to note here is that this is the response in the striatum to music for the musically anhedonic people. This is their response to the gambling. So normal response to gambling, no response to music, both on the left and on the right. And these are the other two groups who respond really quite strongly to both the music and the gambling. And most interesting of all, if we redo this analysis to look at functional connectivity between the reward system and the auditory cortex, what we see is that the level of connectivity, which is shown here, differs very significantly for the musical anhedonics compared to the other two. People with musical anhedonia, as they're listening to music that everyone else finds pleasurable, show almost no interaction, actually it's negative, between these systems. The people with sort of average hedonia show an average response, and the people with hyperhedonia, those are the absolute music lovers, show the biggest response. So there's really something going on between these two systems. And the final little thing I want to tell you is something I'm very excited about. This is not even published, we're just trying to get it published now. We thought, okay, if this is true, right, we don't know why these people are musically anhedonic, we just know that they are. But could we, if this phenomenon is true, could we modulate the response of the reward system and thereby make people either get more or less pleasure to music? Can we actually experimentally manipulate it? And it sounds like science fiction, but it's not. With transcranial magnetic stimulation, if we stimulate the left dorsolateral cortex, we can get activity in the striatum. This was actually shown quite some years ago by Anthony Strafella. So with a certain frequency of stimulation, you can either upregulate or downregulate the striatal system using excitatory or inhibitory theta burst stimulation. And this is the result, which we're just trying to get published now. We had people listen to music. They had to give us a subjective liking rate, how much you like the music they're hearing. We measured their electrodermal response, like we did in the other experiments, and we asked them to bid money, just like we did in the other experiments. And sure enough, when we do the excitatory stimulation, we see that they report that they like it more, they get a bigger physiological response, and they're willing to spend more money on that music. Whereas when we use the inhibitory protocol, they report liking the music less, they have a lower response in electrophysiology, the psychophysiology, and they spend less money on it. So this is, I think, a good test of the hypothesis that if we're modulating the system, we can actually turn it up or turn it down by changing the activity levels of the striatum. And we're following this up with fMRI to confirm that indeed the stimulation, when applied to the frontal cortex, does indeed modulate the reward system, which I can tell you pretty much it does. So in the end, we have, I've told you about the sort of perceptual system here, I've told you about the reward system, the way they come together, and I think the conclusion I want to draw is that music represents some kind of mechanism by which we humans have learned to regulate or enhance our emotional arousal via the interaction of these two systems. And what's interesting is that this is a very phylogenetically ancient system. We share it with many other species. Indeed, most of the work in the reward system is done in rodents. Whereas this is a very evolutionarily recent system, particularly the frontal cortex. So it seems like our ability to not only perceive sound patterns, but also make predictions about upcoming events, is able to then linked up to this ancient reward system, and that's how we get our musical pleasure. So just to end, I want to be sure I thank all of the different people involved. There are too many of them today, but I'll just mention Valerie Salencourt, who did a lot of this work, and also, well, there's Valerie again, and there's Anne Flood, and my colleagues from University of Barcelona and from McGill in Toronto, with whom I did all of the music reward research. And just finally, I'll put in a plug for this meeting that's coming up in just a couple of weeks. If you happen to be in Boston in the middle of June, the 6th meeting of the Neurosciences of Music is going on, and I hope that I might see you there. Thank you.